Hi, this is Vivian from PharmaSalon. Before you watch, I want to let you know that if you're interested in getting a CE credit for this video, go to the show notes below. There's a link to the Compounding CE website that will take you directly to the quiz for this class. The show notes also include the questions on the quiz, so be sure to check them out. While you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel.
Hello, my name is Robert Stannard. This is Jennifer Bellis. We're both attorneys at Benden, Summerall, and Ladner in Atlanta, Georgia. I have a practice that focuses primarily on litigation in the healthcare setting and compliance in the healthcare setting involving hospitals, doctors, pharmacies, and in the pharmacy world, we do a lot in the world of regulation and compliance and work with FDA and other federal and state agencies. This is Jennifer Bellis.
Hi, everyone. As Robert said, I'm Jennifer Bellis, and I work with Benden, Summerall, and Ladner in Atlanta. And my practice as well is also heavily focused on regulatory compliance for state licensed pharmacies, dealing with both issues that arise under federal law and FDA inspections, and also state law as well. And I have a litigation practices that focuses on medical malpractice.
So today we are going to be talking about responding to FDA inspections. I think you've already heard about some good ways to help manage FDA inspections during the process. And we're here today to talk a little bit about what happens afterwards. Quick disclaimer, we do not have any conflicts of interest. I won't stay on that for too much longer. This is the purpose of our time together this afternoon. First is to explain the purpose of an FDA 483 and a warning letter, to talk about the timeline and the best ways to respond to the 483, talk about some consequences for failing to properly respond and the outcomes potentially that can occur as a result of the FDA inspections. At the outset, I think it's helpful for everybody to understand that one of the best ways to familiarize yourself, not just with this process, but also to help prepare for FDA inspections, is to go out and get your hands on as many of the 483s and responses to those 483s as possible. Most of these have been published. They are available through Freedom of Information Act requests, and most are available online through fda.gov. Understanding trends in what the FDA is doing with their 483s, particular issues that they are looking at, whether it's smoke studies or sterility or particular expectations. The best way to keep a handle on that is to stay current on the 483s and the observations and the activity by the FDA. So I want to point that out as something right at the outset.
So right off the bat, one of the first things that we wanted to do was give a broad overview of the different potential actions or outcomes that you can expect might happen after the inspection. It's done, you've had your closeout, FDA leaves, and of course the first thing that everyone is wondering is, all right, well, what happens now? The best outcome, of course, would be that there is no 483 issued or other concerns. That would be ideal, but it's extremely unlikely. So we generally expect that most pharmacies will come away from an inspection with a 483. After that, there may be a suggestion by FDA to stop serial compounding or to conduct a recall, depending on what happened during the inspection. We'll talk more later about how to approach each of those things. About 6 to 9 months down the line, we usually find that most pharmacies that get 483 issues wind up getting warning letters. And again, we'll talk about what those are and how you can provide an effective response to those. Other things that we see sometimes are referrals by FDA to the State Board of Pharmacy. They'll send a copy of the 483 and basically say, state boards, we have a concern about this pharmacy, we think you should follow up. Finally, this is the most severe potential outcome that we see, and that is an injunction and a civil consent decree. And this is where FDA, working with the Department of Justice, essentially threatens to file a lawsuit to stop the pharmacy from continuing with compounding. Again, this is uncommon and rare, and we'll talk about it more later, but it is something to be aware of.
Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the 483. Again, the purpose of the 483 is for investigators to identify potential violations of the FD&C The timeline is that it is typically issued at the conclusion of the inspection, and a response to the 43 has to be provided to FDA within 15 days. A couple of things I wanted to mention about this. Recently, we have seen in a number of FDA inspections, clients or firms who have not received closeout letters from prior inspections in years past. So I want to add one thing to this timeline, and that would be after the 15 days for your response, if you have not already had a closeout, received a closeout from the FDA, calendar and schedule a time to follow up to make sure that you get a closeout of the inspection. I think this helps show that the inspection has been resolved. Any observations by the FDA will have been investigated and concluded, and you sleep better at night knowing that you don't have something hanging over your head. Jennifer?
So, can you please edit that out? I don't understand why I couldn't just make words happen. Thank you, Vivian. Anyways, so as Robert mentioned, one of the first things you need to do after the inspection is prepare a response to the 483. And this can be kind of a time-consuming and tedious process, especially when you just want to put it behind you. But in our experience, preparing a solid response to the 483 is one of the best things that you can do to set yourself up for smooth sailing going forward. So I really encourage all of you, if and when you wind up having to prepare a 483 response, to give it the time and effort that it deserves, because it will pay dividends. A good solid 483 response can help you in a lot of ways. And the first, and I think most important and immediate benefit, is that it's going to reduce the chance that FDA is going to keep coming back and pestering you with questions and wanting more information about what you have done to resolve their concerns. A good 483 response also makes it less likely that you will receive a warning letter, and less likely that FDA will have ongoing concerns about the pharmacy that make it more inclined to consider a recall or a request to stop compounding. Response to the 483 can also be made public. As Robert mentioned, the 483s are all posted, and if you would like, you can request that FDA also post your response on the website, and then also provide that to anyone else that it provides the 483 to. So this is your opportunity to tell your side of the story and either correct anything that's incorrect in the 483, set out why you do not believe that your drugs present any patient safety risk, and explain what you've done to resolve the concerns. On the line, FDA usually does a follow-up inspection on a 2 to 3 year time frame. Having a solid 483 response will help you make that process go much smoother, because FDA will look at the conditions that were raised in the 483. You'll have the good response right there that sets out exactly what you did to resolve the concerns. And if you get any follow-up inquiries from state boards, which we are seeing more and more, you'll have your solid, well-documented 483 response right there ready to go.
All right, a little bit more on the why bother and the form and goals of the 43. I want to make clear from the outset that this is not an opportunity for you to air grievances with the FDA. This is not an opportunity, really, I would say, to escalate any issues or compromise the relationship that you might have with the FDA further by attacking them in the 483. Again, and emphasizing the public nature of these, this is an opportunity for you to respond and to let anybody out there know who has looked at that 43 why they should not be concerned with any of the observations that are on that. In terms of the goals, a few things here I think that are worth discussing. First of all, the adequacy of the practices that you have implemented at the firm. I think that it's important not only to confirm the propriety of these practices, but also to have these appropriately reflected in your SOPs. To the extent that there are any changes that need to take place, go ahead and do that as promptly as you can during the inspection. So come time for the 43, hopefully you have either already addressed it and kept it off of 43, or in the response, you can say that any corrective action has already been taken. It's important, I think, to distinguish why any observation does not present a safety concern. This depends a little bit on the nature of the observation in terms of the response. But I think the more that you can bolster your response to the 43 with objective data that may come in many forms, whether it relates to sterility or testing or environmental monitoring or media fills or even things like training, the more you can bolster and support your responses, particularly as to the safety and the efficacy of the preparations, the better. I think that's going to help both your practice. It's going to help, hopefully, in response to the 43 and steer away any concerns that others who are reviewing the 43 may have. The other thing that I think it's important to keep in mind when responding to a 483, and this is assuming that you are a 503A pharmacy subject to 797, is to always distinguish what you do in your pharmacy by pointing out that as 797 requires, and elaborating from that perspective so that it is very clear the authority to which you have to comply. They understand that you are a 503A compounding pharmacy, not a manufacturer. So I think setting that kind of a framework is also important. A little bit more on the preparation side. And this is something that I expect you may have heard a little bit about during the FDA inspection discussion. But preparing to respond to a 483 really begins as soon as the FDA walks in the door. By that, I mean, my hope is that your pharmacist in charge and your team at the pharmacy, whoever it is, has a good SOP in place that they are prepared to adhere to. And that once the FDA does present and they come into the pharmacy, that you have somebody who is acting as scribe or scrivener and taking down all of the notes and comments and requests from the FDA, writing down questions and answers, and keeping a list of important items for you and the team to follow up on at the end of the day, so that if there is anything that you can do to address a potential concern or an observation, to go ahead and do that so that potentially you avoid that issue showing up on 43. So at the end of each day, I would recommend that you go through these notes, identify any potential areas of follow-up, and certainly keep track of any corrective actions. Make sure that you have a list of any documents provided by the documents provided to the inspector, any samples taken by the inspector. And once the inspection has concluded, you will have a comprehensive resource in the form of your transcript to use to go back and prepare a response to any observations that you do receive. A few key components to a 43 response. First is to place appropriate context. Again, I think pointing out that you are a 503A pharmacy subject to 797, so everybody understands the framework, is extremely important. To the extent that there have been any inaccuracies identified by the FDA in the 483, or if there have been any misperceptions, which we have certainly seen plenty of, ultimately what amounts to an observation that has been driven more by misunderstanding than by safety concern or otherwise. So it's important at the outset to provide the appropriate context, to provide a little bit of information about your firm, to explain, potentially how long you've been in business, the patients you serve, that kind of information, so that everybody has a little bit of context. The next is assurances. Again, as a 503A pharmacy, you are subject to the laws of the state and to USP 797. I think it's important to make sure that that is known. And then in terms of assurances, once again, any data that you can provide, whether it's related to testing or other data, studies, literature, BUD, sterility, endotoxin, any kind of data that helps support a response to an observation, and most importantly, confirms that there is no safety concern, there is no concern with respect to any product that is being dispensed. And then finally, on corrective action, I think it's important, if you can, again, to try and check off any potential corrective action at the end of each day so that you don't have much, if anything, to do by the time a 483 is issued. To the extent that you haven't done that, and there are areas for improvement, even if it is beyond 797, I think it's helpful to articulate for the FDA and in response to a 483 exactly when any corrective action was taken, the fact that it may be over and above any requirements, but that it is something that is being implemented in the continuous drive for improved patient safety and quality. And I think it's a good opportunity to address any of that in the 483, in the response, I should say.
So now we want to talk a little bit about the tone and overall tenor of the response, less so than just the substance. As Robert mentioned, first and foremost, this is not the place to focus on grievances with FDA. Of course, it's a good place to point out that you are a 503A pharmacy, but taking a combative or adversarial tone that FDA doesn't have the authority to regulate you, or doesn't know what they're talking about, or doesn't understand compounding, is not productive here. It's certainly something that you can speak with your attorneys or your other pharmacists about after the inspection is all done. But if you put it in the 483, all you will accomplish is giving FDA the impression that you are not interested in complying with what they believe you need to do to protect patient safety. And you will give your readers the impression that you are more focused on complaining than you are on patient safety. And that is very unlikely to actually be true. But again, that's the impression that will be given off. The response should be clear and organized. We usually recommend that you restate the observations and then address each one individually. As I mentioned, focusing on facts and not emotions or grievances. Being thorough, specific, and detailed. And this ties into what Robert was saying earlier, but you really do want to make sure that you take the time to explain thoroughly each key component in your response to every observation. And that means why this isn't a patient safety concern, what you have done to address FDA's concerns, and why what your current practices at the time of the inspection were compliant with state law. And again, if you imagine this from the perspective of someone who is reading this 483 response, they're reading this and they're saying, okay, well, do I need to be concerned about the drugs that I'm getting from this pharmacy? Is this pharmacy actually failing to comply with what they're supposed to be doing? What is this pharmacy going to do to make sure that there are no issues in the future? And you want to make sure that you answer for your reader each of those questions. Again, a conciliatory, respectful tone goes a long way. Emphasizing that you take FDA's concerns and public health seriously is helpful. In my experience, a lot of the situations where FDA does escalate to regulatory action after an inspection, it's when FDA has concern that the pharmacy is not interested or willing in making safety improvements. So the more you can do to project that that is your primary concern, the farther you're going to get in assuring FDA that they do not need to worry about your pharmacy. Mm-hmm. Evidence and documents. We've talked a lot about the content of the 483 response, but FDA also really wants to see evidence. It's not enough to simply say our sterility test results for this batch that is addressed in the 483 were good. You're going to need to provide them. It's not enough to say we updated our SOPs. If you just say that and don't provide a copy of the updated SOP, FDA is going to come back and ask you for it in a month or 9 months or a year. So we have found in our experience that it's better to go ahead and provide the evidence of your corrective actions or your safety assurances on the front end. And there is some strategy to deciding what documents to provide and in what context. And again, that's something that is really specific to each observation. You don't want to provide too many documents that run the risk of generating new questions or giving FDA new material to pour over. But you do want to make sure that you provide enough documentation necessary to prove to FDA that you have done what you said you're going to do.
All right, so talk about a couple of examples here in terms of not so good responses in response to observations and spanning the spectrum up to something probably a little better. So in this case, we've got an observation that you use household cleaners such as Dawn to clean glassware without providing any evidence that these cleaners are effective at removing residue. Not a great response is to just say that it complies with 795 and FDA has no right to hold the pharmacy to CGMP standards. That, while may be true, comes across as more combative and does not send the message that the pharmacy is primarily interested in patient safety. It does not sound particularly invested, and that's not going to inspire confidence necessarily in the FDA or others who are reviewing your response. A preferable response would be that USP 795 does not prohibit the use of household cleaners, and out of an abundance of caution, the pharmacy will switch to a lab-grade cleaner. That's helpful. It's certainly not as combative. It recognizes the distinction and points out 795, but we can still do better. And I think the best here, and actually I would revise this best just a little bit to say, as explained during the inspection, Dawn complies with state law and USP 795. However, out of an abundance of caution, the pharmacy has switched to using Alkanox to clean its glassware, and the SOPs were updated, and this practice was implemented on the following date. There you have distinguished the fact that you are in compliance with the applicable regulations. You have voiced your interest and ultimate goal in making sure that we are doing everything we can to protect patient safety. And you have talked about a change that you have made that is over and above what you are required to. That, I think, is the goal that you are striving towards in responding to any of these observations.
One more example with the different observation, and this is one that we see pretty frequently, not necessarily rubber gaskets, but some observation that a surface in the clean room is difficult to clean. Your clean room had surfaces that were difficult to clean. Specifically, we observed rubber gaskets, which may harbor microbial growth, presenting a risk of contamination. So an insufficient response would be, the gaskets are easy to clean. Pharmacy has not had any patient complaints or adverse events and does not compound drugs under insanitary conditions. So this response lacks a couple of important elements. The first one is there's simply no reasoning behind the response. It's basically nothing more than saying that the FDA is inaccurate without providing any reason why. Saying that the pharmacy hasn't had any patient complaints or adverse events, while somewhat helpful, is simply not good enough from what FDA, their current perspective, which is that they want the pharmacy to show that there is no potential for contamination. A better response is, we disagree that the gaskets are difficult to clean or may harbor microbial growth. The gaskets are made from antimicrobial material specifically designed for use in clean rooms. This response is better because it does provide some reasoning and assures the reader that some care went into the decision about where to get this material from, and provides a basis for the pharmacy's knowledge that there's not a contamination risk. It still lacks a couple important elements, including that it doesn't discuss CGMP versus USP requirements, and it doesn't contain any kind of supporting documentation. the reader or FDA still has to take this at face value. And we know that FDA is not going to want to do that. The best response is, we disagree that the gaskets are difficult to clean or may harbor microbial growth. The gaskets are specifically designed for use in clean rooms and are made from smooth material that does not support microbial growth. Please see attached product specification obtained from the manufacturer, which demonstrates that the material does not support microbial growth. Moreover, the pharmacy's viable air sampling results and surface sampling results for the previous 6 months are all within specification. In accordance with USP 797, the pharmacy conducts sterility testing on all lots of 25 units. All sterility test results within the past 6 months have been passing. Thus, we do not believe the gaskets present an insanitary condition or threat to patient safety.
So not to hammer this too much, but again, as you can see, the best response is one which is driven by data, which you have produced and you've attached. You have talked about the basis for your response, and you've referenced the appropriate regulatory authority. It lays it all out there, and again, is going to inspire much more confidence in the reader than some of the other alternatives here. Turning next to potential outcomes, and we'll talk about these individually. The best potential outcome is no 483, or maybe a 483 with a very mild observation that is the inspection is then closed without anything further. Unfortunately, things do escalate. We often see them escalate, and that can happen in the form of a warning letter, again, which we're going to talk about some more. It can occur with reporting to the state board. This oftentimes occurs very informally, and it depends a little bit on the jurisdiction. But as you may know, it's not uncommon to see state board inspectors arrive with the FDA to conduct the inspection together, particularly in those cases where there are concerns about a particular firm. It is not uncommon for those concerns to be communicated from the FDA to the state board. To the extent that the state board does follow up, obviously you want to make the point that the pharmacy is compliant with state law and the appropriate USP, and otherwise, I think provide a lot of the same reassurances and data that you would in response to the FDA. Moving on up the chain, you can have a request for a recall. The FDA can ask that you cease compounding. These are both requests that the FDA can make, but are not mandatory simply based on the request. It becomes mandatory at the point that the FDA goes and obtains an injunction from a court that orders that the pharmacy stop compounding.
So we'll talk about warning letters first. This first slide is essentially just an overview of what a warning letter is and why it's issued. The stated purpose is that a warning letter evidences potential for enforcement action, but first seeks final corrective action for violations of FDA statutes or regulations. That sounds very serious, and I think it is important to emphasize that a warning letter is not a legally binding final determination by FDA that the pharmacy has violated the FDCA or any other laws. It's still an important document that should be taken seriously, but this by itself is not a formal accusation of any kind of unlawful activity. Warning letters often request additional information. For example, if FDA still has questions after reviewing the pharmacy's response to the 483 or thinks that some additional documentation is needed, that's often requested directly in a warning letter. And then most of the time, the warning letter will simply repeat some or all of the observations without any changes. Once in a while, other issues that did not come up on the 483, but that may have been raised during the inspection, may show up on a warning letter. You have the opportunity to respond to these, and that time frame is another 15 working day response time. When forming a response to a warning letter, a lot of the same principles for responding to the 483 also apply here. So we will not belabor those again, but the goal is the same. You want to reassure FDA and any other readers that they do not need to be concerned about your pharmacy's practices, and instill confidence that you are doing what you need to do to comply with the law that applies to you and protecting patient safety. If you get a warning letter where FDA is still expressing concern about some of your corrective actions, this is a time to seriously consider whether you can make additional improvements, even if it goes beyond what 797 requires, even if it might be expensive. This is a situation where an ounce of prevention can really be worth a pound of cure. And it's definitely a situation where you want to take it seriously and consider whether it's worth it in the long run to just go ahead and do what it is that FDA is asking. It's also a good opportunity to address any other progress you've made on corrective actions since the 483 response was sent in. So we always recommend that you provide a response to a warning letter. Leaving one completely unattended and ignoring it is not going to have any beneficial impacts for the pharmacy. It's going to send the message to FDA that they cannot trust that you are taking the FDA's concerns seriously or taking patient safety seriously, and it's likely to result in heightened scrutiny from the agency and potential follow-up regulatory actions. And those could include what you see listed here. And of course, the biggest concern would be that FDA would seek an injunction to stop you from compounding altogether.
So next two slides involve really other potential responses by the FDA and include cessation of compounding here. And then I'm also sort of including under this umbrella of the suggested recall. First of all, again, these are both recommendations and requests that the FDA can make, but without a court order or an injunction, it's not binding. If you have reached the point of the FDA asking that you cease compounding, I think you have some, depending on the issues, a real balancing act in terms of your next steps. This should always, I think, primarily be geared and addressed first by looking at patient safety. And if there is any legitimate concern with your compounding process or your dispensed product. Even if you are confident in that, if you refuse to cease compounding, then that's certainly something that the FDA can make public, and they can and likely will threaten you with an injunction or their desire to go out and get an injunction to force you to stop compounding. So, again, I think you've got to weigh the pros and cons of any decision moving forward here. This is probably a pretty good time to have a discussion with counsel, depending on the individual circumstances of the inspection and the request or the ask by the FDA to cease compounding. Same thing with suggested recall. Again, this is not something that can be compelled, but if the FDA asks for a recall and they have identified a sufficient concern as to why, then you have to balance the potential effects of a refusal to do the recall. Again, the FDA is going to respond by attempting to escalate that concern. If they have asked you to cease compounding, if they have asked you to perform a recall and they have sufficient concern about something that they found during their inspection, then it is very likely that they will continue to pursue that and certainly at least articulate their intention to get a court involved. Again, this is a time that you've got to really evaluate any potential risks to patients, the potential burden of doing a recall, the reasons for it, and I think it's a thorough analysis and balancing act relating to those that's going to inform your decision.
We're sort of jumping back to the warning letter here. What happens with the large majority of pharmacies is that FDA's regulatory action stops with a warning letter. FDA does not request that you stop compounding or suggest that you do a recall. So one of the questions that we get most often is, after the 483 response is sent, after a warning letter response is sent, well, what happens next? And the reality is that at this point, you can expect to hear radio silence from FDA for potentially a very long time, which is not very satisfying. On the one hand, no news is good news. It means FDA is not, again, planning to come in and say, we think that you should stop sterile compounding. On the other hand, it leaves open just an open question as to the status of the inspection. As Robert mentioned earlier, we really recommend that you proactively seek a closeout letter, not immediately after you send the warning letter response, but how often would you say? Several months down the line?
Yeah, I would certainly calendar some follow-up for a couple of months out. And, getting that closeout letter, in addition to providing some finality, I understand that some people may be reluctant to call up the FDA once they're finally out of your pharmacy and concluded with the inspection. You've responded to a 483 to say, hey guys, I never got my closeout letter. But I do think it's important, as much as anything else, and you can see this on the list here, is that you can expect a follow-up inspection. And what we have seen in recent inspections, the FDA now has, on a few different occasions, referred to the fact that there is this sort of cadence that they are following. And we have multiple clients now who, it seems like every September, or pick your month of the year, every other September, every other July, FDA seems to be showing up fairly regularly. If you have a closeout letter from your prior inspection, you have a confined list of potential observations or concerns that were discussed. You may have a determination that you are a 503A pharmacy, even though it gives you a snapshot. To the extent that your pharmacy hasn't changed substantially, or to the extent that your practices have remained largely the same, when the FDA comes back in, then that closeout letter and your prior observations really help provide some context and hopefully guidance on how you move forward. And, it also, I think, makes it a little bit more difficult. So those certainly does not prevent the FDA from bringing up issues that have been present at the pharmacy potentially for 4, 5, 6 years through multiple inspections, have never changed, but that the FDA has never had a problem with in the past. And the closeout letter can really, I think, help frame, again, the conclusion of the inspection. You now have memorialized in time what any observations or concerns would have been. And so that allows you, I guess, to move forward with a little bit more information and guidance, and also to some extent try and show the FDA what their findings were, and if they do raise concerns with things they've seen multiple times, then ask why that hadn't been addressed up until this point. So again, I would emphasize we are happy to answer any questions individually, offline, online, or otherwise. I really cannot advocate enough for looking at prior 483s, even if you just get 483s available for the most recent couple of years and responses to those. That is going to prepare you best for the inspection, which is hopefully going to help alleviate the need for responding to a 483. So please don't hesitate to contact us with any questions.
Excellent. So I love hearing stories. I think stories, they make everything more entertaining, and they also are very good illustratively. And I just couldn't help but think, when you guys were going over the responses, do people really say things like, one of the ones you had there was like, no, what are you talking about? It's totally, I can clean that area. It's not a problem. And you're
that's great. Wait. Okay. So the question is, do people really respond to 483s in a way that completely disregards FDA concern? And the answer is, unfortunately, yes. Some people take a very combative approach with the FDA, but that is typically not limited to the 483 response, right? So by the time you're writing that 483, FDA has been in your pharmacy. You've had a lot of discussions with FDA inspectors. You may have had discussions with other people at FDA or CDER. And if you are articulating that kind of a response in your 483 or in the response, then that's pretty indicative of what we see in terms of the conduct and the level of adversarial environment during the inspection itself. And so you do have pharmacists who think that the FDA has no business walking in their pharmacy, that they have good relationships with the state board, that they have no concerns about anything that they're doing. And it takes a lot of work under those circumstances to make sure that the response that you provide is productive, and ultimately it's going to put you in the best position. If you are intent on getting in a fight with the FDA or otherwise unnecessarily combative, then you're really making your job a little bit harder.
But that way you guys get to make more money then, right?
I'm sorry?
I said you guys get to make more money.
Yes.
So basically you should be like, if you want to make me rich, go ahead and be as combative as you want.
Right. I mean, litigating in federal court when you get a cease and desist letter and an injunction is a lot of revenue for the firm, but it's a lot of headache to pharmacy.
Yeah, I'm sure.
I did want to add to what Robert said. We do sometimes see responses that are inadequate towards the bad, insufficient side of the scale, even when the pharmacy isn't necessarily taking a combative attitude. I see this happen sometimes when, for whatever reason, the pharmacist just doesn't quite seem to grasp that from FDA's perspective, it is no longer sufficient to say that FDA has to come in and find a problem with my pharmacy, either to find something that is actually contaminated or find an instance of patient safety or a blatant failure by a pharmacy to follow the rules. That's not FDA's ballgame anymore. FDA wants you to prove that you are doing everything necessary to ensure patient safety. And if your response is only going to say, well, FDA didn't point out any problems, you're just going to be talking past each other and you're never going to meet FDA where they want you to be. Yeah. So it may not be combative or malicious, but it's not the right mindset that's going to get you through the inspection and get you through the response.
Right.
And that's the much more common scenario, is simply inadequacy. If somebody, I keep thinking about one of the same inspections we had where, you were constantly concerned about anything the pharmacist was going to say. But to the extent that you need to educate the inspectors or educate the FDA or provide affirmative data in order to meet the burden, which for better or worse, they have set, that's why you got to make sure to include it all.
So you brought up a good issue, and something that I hear a lot of challenges is, which sometimes is the state pharmacy board and the FDA are not always seeing eye to eye. So you have a situation where, like you were just saying, well, what do you mean? It's fine with my state pharmacy board. So how do you navigate that when the state pharmacy, and sometimes it's completely opposite, like you'll get in trouble if you do it the way the FDA wants it, then the state pharmacy board gets upset. So how do you navigate that situation?
So there are a couple of circumstances like that you do run into from time to time, and I will tell you, we have worked with a couple of pharmacies where the conflicts between FDA expectation and state law has resulted in those pharmacies electing to discontinue their licensure in some states.
Oh, wow.
So it sort of varies depending on where you are talking about. I think for pharmacists, the greatest headaches in this form come where if they're licensed in multiple states, the FDA comes in, issues a 43, there are some concerning observations, they have a conversation maybe with the home state, which results in discipline, which then has to be reported to all of the other state boards. And for a lot of folks who are licensed in a majority of the states out there, that is a huge compliance, regulatory, responsive burden,
financial burden
to the extent that
CMS
discipline for each of the potential boards, to the extent that you run afoul of any of the state laws. It's a domino effect that can be pretty grueling. So yeah, best to avoid if you can.
I will add to that. I think that if you've got an observation and complying with FDA's expectations is going to put you afoul of state law, it really is kind of a case-by-case analysis. And I think you need to consider what the issue is. And then also, your state board, your state laws. How seriously do they take this issue? Is there a way that you can open up a dialogue with your state inspectors, your state board, and let them know what the issue is, and if they have any advice as a strategy that you could take? But there's not really a one-size-fits-all answer for that. And I think it really depends on the severity of the observation and, what other potential mitigating options there are available.
Okay, because I was going to say, I remember somebody telling me about a story how it was about a sink, and the state board wanted the sink in one area, and the federal FDA wanted the sink in another area. And he was able to talk them through it and be like, well, what you're saying doesn't really make sense in terms of, what it is you're trying to achieve. In that situation, then would it behoove somebody to say, okay, I've got these 483s or observations from the FDA. They're in conflict with the pharmacy board is saying I need to bring in a consultant who can maybe get everybody on the same page. Like, would that be a strategy?
I think with that kind of a thing, it's helpful to articulate the conflict so that everybody's aware of it. FDA knows about it, state board knows about it. Oftentimes, those conflicts, I think, occur because of a misunderstanding, especially as it relates to compounding. This is not CGMPs. It's a different set of rules. The state board rules vary a little bit, though mostly have a good bit of consistency. And so before you take about any corrective action and undertake the expense and time of doing that, I think you want to do as much as you can to make sure that FDA and the state board are on the same page about, whatever proposed fix that you have in mind is going to be enough to satisfy both entities. And again, talk about being between a rock and a hard place. At the end of the day, and it also ties in a little bit to how secure you are in your 503A status, right? So assuming that the FDA does not have jurisdiction to come in and tell you exactly what to do in the same way that the state board does, ultimately, as a 503A pharmacy, your responsibility is to comply with the state laws, the Board of Pharmacy. And so, to the extent that they are demanding something and failure to do so results in discipline, you got to listen.
All right. Excellent. Any more tips to the trade? I know they're probably all in the PowerPoint. Thank you for watching. Remember, if you would like ACPE credit for this lecture, click on the link below and register for the class. You won't have to watch the video again, just answer the quiz questions. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you can be updated on all our latest content.